The Nile doesn't just carry water, it carries time. Its banks have seen gods rise in limestone, dynasties fall into dust, and languages fade into silence. But buried beneath all this lies something even older than hieroglyphs. Something far more permanent. DNA. When researchers first unlocked the genetic code of mummies from the heart of ancient Egypt, they weren't just chasing history. They were trying to answer a question older than the pyramids. Who were the ancient Egyptians, really? The answers they uncovered didn't just whisper, they roared. From the royal tombs of Abusir el-Meleq, where the dead had slept undisturbed for over 3 millennia, scientists extracted full genomes from the bones of mummified remains. These were not the incomplete, damaged snippets once dismissed by skeptics. These were full sequences, clear enough to map ancestry, migration, and identity. And the results were stunning. Genetically, these ancient Egyptians were not most closely related to sub-Saharan Africans, nor were they deeply tied to the European groups that would later settle Alexandria or rule from Rome. Instead, they were closest to Bronze Age populations of the Near East, people from the Levant, Anatolia, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Farmers, herders, and city builders from regions that had already shaped the early pulse of civilization. Despite centuries of conquests, Libyan pharaohs, Persian satraps, Hellenistic kings, Roman governors, the genetic core of Egypt's ancient population barely shifted. Over 1,300 years, their DNA held steady, preserving a biological continuity that defied political collapse. The Y-chromosomal haplogroups were telling. E1b1b, with roots in Northeast Africa, and J, the ancient marker of Semitic-speaking peoples. On the maternal side, mitochondrial haplogroups like H, T, and J, all common in prehistoric West Eurasia, appeared again and again in the mummies. This genetic signature spoke of long-standing links to the Fertile Crescent, not recent foreign occupation. These weren't invaders. These were the builders of temples, the carvers of sphinxes, the namers of stars. And perhaps the most remarkable fact? Even during the Roman occupation, even in the final centuries before the Arab conquest, the genetic data shows almost no drastic change. These people, who worshipped Osiris, revered the dead, and inscribed eternity into stone, were still genetically aligned with the ancestors who built the first pyramids. But here's the twist. Today's Egyptians aren't identical to those ancient mummies. Something did change, not during the reign of the pharaohs, but afterward. After Egypt fell silent, new bloodlines flowed in, and modern Egyptians carry a genetic story more complex, more global, and more layered than ever before. We'll explore that transformation in the next chapter, the moment when Egypt's unbroken bloodline was joined by new travelers, and the Nile's genome changed forever. But before we go there, let's ask something deeper. If the builders of the pyramids weren't genetically like today's populations, does it change how we view them? Or does it finally bring us closer to understanding who they really were? And if you've watched this far and haven't subscribed yet, seriously, what are you waiting for? This is just the beginning. Hit that button, because what's coming next will reshape everything you thought you knew about African and Mediterranean history. Time has a way of fooling us. We imagine Egypt as a frozen museum, a place where the past stands still. But Egypt didn't stand still. It evolved, not just in architecture or language, but deep beneath the skin, in the very essence of who its people were. And that change, when it came, didn't roar like a conquest. It whispered, quietly, through mothers and children, through merchants crossing deserts, through footsteps taken on forgotten caravan trails. You see, the ancient Egyptian genome, the one preserved in mummies for over 1,000 years, told a remarkably stable story. But then something shifted, and modern Egyptians, though still tethered to that legacy, now carry a different balance of ancestry. How different? Modern Egyptians have up to 20% more sub-Saharan African ancestry than their ancient ancestors. And the most fascinating part? That shift didn't happen under the pharaohs, or during Greek rule, or even under Roman banners. It happened much later, just 700 years ago, roughly 24 generations, which means for every child born in a Cairo apartment or an Aswan village today, 1/4 of their ancestral story might have entered Egypt during the medieval Islamic era, not the pharaonic Golden Age. Why? Because the medieval period brought more than religion and empire. It brought movement, vast, steady, relentless. The trans-Saharan slave trade moved not just people, but genes. For centuries, East African women were brought into Egypt, some as slaves, others as wives or concubines. Many bore children. Their descendants stayed, lived, and became Egyptian. But here's the twist. This wasn't conquest. It wasn't war. It was something more human. Intimacy, family, survival. The African haplogroups that now appear more frequently in Egypt, particularly in mitochondrial DNA, came from real women, living real lives, in the shadows of trade and empire. And the DNA proves it. Admixture dating places the rise in sub-Saharan ancestry in Egypt around the 14th century CE. Not coincidentally, that's the height of caravan networks, the expansion of Islamic trade routes, and the flourishing of Nile-based commerce. So if you're imagining a giant wave sweeping in overnight, erase that. This was a drip, a pulse, a quiet infusion of bloodlines that reshaped the nation over time. But it didn't erase what came before. That's the beauty of Egyptian DNA. It's not a replacement story. It's an accumulation story. The E1b1b haplogroups tied to Northeast Africa are still there. The Levantine and Anatolian threads remain woven in, but they're joined now by Nilotic strands, by East African echoes, by migrations that the pyramids never recorded, but the blood did. And that makes us ask something uncomfortable. Why do we cling so tightly to a static image of ancient Egypt when its real history was in constant motion? Maybe it's because change, real biological change, forces us to let go of myths. But here's the truth, backed by data. The Egyptians of today are not foreign to their land. They are the descendants of pharaohs, farmers, slaves, merchants, and migrants alike. And every one of them is part of a genetic story that no empire could rewrite. What would your ancestry look like if someone sequenced it 700 years from now? Would your children's DNA still tell your story? Or would it whisper something else? And if you haven't hit subscribe yet, come on. This journey through time is just getting deeper. Stick around, because the next chapter doesn't just change Egypt's story. It changes everything we thought we knew about how genetics carries memory. Imagine standing at a Cairo street corner. The faces you see, the voices you hear, the skin tones, eye shapes, accents. They didn't appear here overnight. They're echoes. Each one carries whispers of another age, another place. Levantine warriors, Saharan traders, Greek settlers, Nubian queens. And somehow, all of them became Egyptian. But how? Because Egypt has always been more than a nation. It's been a corridor, carved between two deserts, stretched between two continents, with the Nile as its eternal artery. Let's rewind. Before the Sahara dried and turned to sand, there were people crossing it freely. They weren't African or Eurasian, as we label them today. They were just people moving, surviving, mating, blending. And some of those early travelers left behind more than pottery. They left genes. Then came the Neolithic wave. Not invaders, but farmers. From the Levant, from Anatolia, bringing wheat, goats, and lineages. They didn't conquer, they married. And in doing so, they embedded Near Eastern DNA into the very birth of Egyptian civilization. Haplogroups like J and E1b1b didn't just arrive. They seeded Egypt's first cities. Then came the Hyksos, a mystery wrapped in dust. Semitic-speaking rulers who entered the Nile Delta around 1650 BC. Were they conquerors or immigrants who rose to power? Either way, their genetic legacy is real. Not dominant, but present. A subtle trace in the bloodlines of northern Egypt, blending in like a thread you don't notice until you follow it back. But no migration shaped Egypt quite like Nubia did. From the deep south came not just armies, but royalty. The 25th dynasty was ruled by Kushite pharaohs, black African kings, whose statues still tower in forgotten temples. And their reign wasn't brief or symbolic. They ruled Egypt as Egyptians. And genetically, they left a mark, particularly in Upper Egypt, where sub-Saharan haplogroups appear more frequently even today. Now pause. What does it mean that Pharaoh Ramesses III, one of the most powerful rulers of the 20th dynasty, carried a Y haplogroup common in West Africa? What does it mean that Tutankhamun's family, buried in the Valley of the Kings, carried a lineage more common in Western Europe. It means blood doesn't follow borders, and ancestry doesn't care about empire. Greeks came next, with Alexander's conquest and the Ptolemaic dynasty. But even they weren't as genetically transformative as you might think. Why? Because they ruled from palaces, not villages. The Egyptian farmer? He didn't intermarry with the Greek elite. He lived as his ancestors had, rooted, continuous, unchanged. Then the Romans arrived. Trade exploded. Cities swelled. Mediterranean genes began to trickle in, not as conquerors, but as merchants, craftsmen, travelers. In places like Alexandria, where cultures collided, small traces of Southern European haplogroups remain. R1b, G2a. They're faint, but they're there. And then came the Arabs. This wasn't just an invasion. It was a transformation. Language, religion, identity. And yes, genetics. Y haplogroup J1, a marker of Arabian tribes, entered Egypt in greater numbers, especially in the east and Sinai. But again, this didn't erase what was there. It joined it. And for 1,000 years after, the movements never stopped. Traders from Somalia, slaves from Sudan, pilgrims from Mecca, even Turks and Circassians during the Ottoman Age. Each brought genes, drops of DNA that added color to the Egyptian mosaic. Now here's the most haunting question of all. How much of your identity comes from stories, and how much comes from blood you'll never know you carry? Egypt's DNA doesn't have sharp lines. It has gradients. From north to south, east to west, a spectrum of ancestry that refuses to sit still. And yet, somehow, it's unmistakably Egyptian. So the next time someone asks, what did ancient Egyptians look like? Maybe the better question is, which generation are you talking about? Because over 5,000 years, Egypt was never one thing. It was everything. When you look into the face of a modern Egyptian, in Cairo traffic, or sailing a felucca in Aswan, you're not just seeing a person. You're seeing a genetic archive, a scroll written in blood, carrying 5 millennia of human movement, conquest, love, loss, and memory. But here's the catch. That archive doesn't read like a single author's work. It's an anthology. So what happens when scientists try to decode it? In 2020, Egypt launched one of its most ambitious projects, the EgyptRef genome, the first full sequencing of modern Egyptian DNA. And what it revealed wasn't a single origin, but 4. Middle Eastern, European, North African, East African. Think about that. Not one dominant source. 4 major ancestries, woven so tightly together that even modern Egyptians themselves can't trace where one ends and another begins. On average, modern Egyptians carry about 27% Middle Eastern, 24% European Eurasian, 15% indigenous North African, and 9% East African ancestry. And the rest? A delicate blend of lesser signals, Anatolian, Arabian, even faint South Asian echoes. It's like a digital fingerprint of the crossroads Egypt has always been. But let's go deeper. Unlike countries where ancestry splits sharply, Egypt's genetic profile is surprisingly homogeneous. Whether you're from Giza or Luxor, Port Said or Fayum, your DNA likely shares the same basic architecture. That means these layers of ancestry aren't scattered. They're fused. So how does that happen? Because Egypt didn't just absorb migration. It digested it, blended it, and passed it down intact, generation after generation. But there's more. Coptic Egyptians, Egypt's Christian minority, offer an unexpected window into the past. Why? Because many Coptic communities maintained high endogamy for centuries, especially after the Islamic conquests. That isolation created a genetic time capsule. And when tested, their genome aligns more closely with ancient mummies than any other group in the country. Does that mean Copts are more Egyptian? No, but it does mean their blood preserves an echo, unshaken by some of the later waves that swept through Egypt's cities and trade hubs. And what about geography? Modern genetics paints a vertical gradient across the map of Egypt. In the south, closer to Nubia and Sudan, East African components rise. Haplogroups like E1b1a, MNAL3, and even minor Nilotic signals appear more frequently. In the north, especially the delta, Eurasian lineages dominate. Haplogroups like J1, R1b, and mtDNA H and T It's as if the Nile itself became a canvas, and every wave of migration painted a different section. But here's the part that catches everyone off guard. Despite all these inputs, Egyptians didn't become fragmented. Their DNA became unified. Why? Because Egypt's population didn't shatter under foreign influence. It absorbed it. Quietly. Persistently. Think about that. The people didn't just survive invasions, they inherited from them. And that leads to one powerful truth. Modern Egyptians are not copies of the past. They're continuations. Not identical, but aligned. Not frozen in time, but flowing forward. So next time someone says, modern Egyptians look different from the pharaohs, ask them this. Shouldn't they? Because history didn't stop when the pyramids were finished. It kept moving, and Egypt moved with it. And if you're still watching this, you're not just interested in genetics. You're searching for identity. Hit subscribe, because what comes next will not only connect Egypt to Africa, it might challenge what you thought the entire continent's genetic story looked like. They wore crowns of gold, ruled over empires, and were buried with gods. But did the pharaohs leave behind more than monuments? Their temples still echo with prayers carved in stone. But their true legacy? It's locked in the deepest vault of all, the genome. And once we opened that vault, the story became far more complicated than anyone expected. Take Ramesses III, the warrior king of the 20th dynasty. A pharaoh who defended Egypt from foreign invaders, but may himself have carried a lineage from far beyond the Nile. In 2012, DNA analysis revealed his Y chromosome belonged to haplogroup 1b1a, a lineage that's most common today not in Egypt, but in West Africa. Hold on. How? This is a man worshipped as a god, buried in the Valley of the Kings, and his paternal ancestry might trace to sub-Saharan populations? That doesn't rewrite history. It expands it, because it means royal blood in Egypt wasn't genetically pure. It was diverse, like the empire it ruled. Now consider the boy king, Tutankhamun. His lineage is no less surprising. His family was assigned to haplogroup R1b, a genetic branch common in Western Europe. Yes, Europe. So while Hollywood imagined the pharaohs as one thing, their DNA tells us they were something else entirely, a genetic reflection of the world they dominated. But let's not stop at paternal lines. Tutankhamun's maternal ancestry included haplogroups like K and H2b, both widespread across the ancient Near East and Europe, which means even his mother's side carried genetic echoes of regions far beyond the Nile Valley. And this isn't mythology. These are published studies, verified lab results. And yes, they spark controversy. But here's the truth that cuts through the noise. Egyptian royalty was not sealed off from the world. It was connected to it, through marriage alliances, through conquest, through cultural exchange, through blood. And it makes you wonder, did the Egyptians know their rulers came from different lineages? Or was ancestry something they simply accepted as divine, regardless of origin? Imagine being a royal priest, embalming the body of a pharaoh whose father's lineage began 3,000 miles to the southwest, or whose mother's haplogroup matched that of a Mycenaean noblewoman. Would it matter? To them, maybe not. To us, it changes everything. Because we've spent centuries trying to paint Egypt in modern racial categories. But DNA refuses to play that game. It shows us something far more nuanced, that even at the highest levels of power, Egypt was always more genetically blended than any single label can describe. So what does this mean for national identity? It means the concept of a single, unchanging Egyptian look has never existed. Even the kings didn't match each other. The mummies show it. The genome confirms it. And yet, they were all Egyptian, not because of purity, but because of continuity. Power didn't come from having the right ancestry. It came from belonging to the land, serving the gods, and being part of Egypt's eternal rhythm. And now, centuries later, it's the DNA that speaks their truth. In silence, in code, in patterns written long before borders, nations, or politics ever existed. So next time you hear someone claim what a real Egyptian should look like, ask them, which dynasty, which tomb, which chromosome? Because the deeper we dig, the more we find. Egypt never belonged to one people. It was, and still is, a masterpiece made of many. If that surprised you, wait till you see where those ancestral threads go next. And if you haven't subscribed yet, you're missing the next twist in the story. Because in the final chapter, we uncover how Egypt's geography itself shaped the DNA of a civilization. Before genes were ever mapped, before kingdoms rose from stone, before names like Egypt even existed, there was geography. And it didn't just shape rivers, cities, or borders. It shaped people, down to their chromosomes. Egypt's land is deceptive. At first glance, it seems simple, a desert with a river. But that river, the Nile, is no ordinary feature. It's the spine of the nation, and for thousands of years, it was the only thread binding three worlds together: Africa, Asia, and Europe. And through that artery came genes. Northward flowed African pastoralists, Nubian warriors, Nilotic families. Southward came Levantine settlers, Arabian merchants, Greek colonists. Egypt was never cut off. It was wide open by design. But what makes this truly astonishing is that modern genetic data confirms what ancient trade routes only hinted at. Look closely at the genome of a modern Egyptian, and you'll find something rare: an unusually balanced blend of African, Middle Eastern, and European markers. How does that happen? It's not just history. It's topography. Let's break it down. To the west lies the Sahara, a vast genetic firewall. Unlike Morocco or Algeria, where desert isolation limited gene flow, Egypt remained connected. Why? Because the Nile cuts through it like a living highway. People didn't have to cross dunes. They followed water. That's why we see sub-Saharan African mitochondrial lineages, like L2 and L3, appearing steadily in Upper Egypt. They didn't arrive by accident. They moved up the Nile, generation after generation. And to the northeast, the Sinai Peninsula, a natural land bridge. No oceans, no mountains, just open desert. That corridor funneled in Semitic tribes, Neolithic farmers, Arab soldiers, and later pilgrims from the Hijaz. Geneticists now call this flow isolation by distance. The closer you were to the Sinai, the more Eurasian your genome became. The farther south you lived, toward Aswan or the Sudanese border, the stronger the African signal grew. And yet, nobody was isolated. That's the genius of Egypt's layout. Even the most remote village in Upper Egypt could eventually feel the pulse of the Mediterranean. Even Bedouins in the eastern desert carry lineages that trace back to Arabia. And even the Berbers of Siwa Oasis, surrounded by silence, hold genetic ties to North Africa's ancient past. It's not diversity, it's continuity. But here's the twist. Even after millennia of migrations, the core structure of Egypt's population has stayed shockingly consistent. Genetic drift happened, yes. Admixture occurred. But the ancient ancestry wasn't erased. It was layered. Imagine a painting that's been added to for 5,000 years, but never scrubbed. One study found that Egyptians today still cluster genetically closer to Levantines and Northeast Africans than to populations farther west in North Africa. That means modern Egyptians are more connected to Syrians or Ethiopians, genetically, than to Moroccans or Tunisians. Why? Because of how the Nile, the Red Sea, and the Mediterranean positioned Egypt. It was a genetic funnel, not a barrier. Now pause. What does this mean for identity? It means that Egyptian DNA isn't just about ethnicity. It's about location. It's about what happens when land pulls people in and never lets them go. So if you're Egyptian, or descended from Egyptians, your DNA carries not just ancestors, but directions. It holds traces of the winds that blew from the Sahara, the ships that sailed from Greece, the caravans that crossed Sinai. It's a map, and your body is the border. So ask yourself, if geography shaped the DNA of a civilization, how much has it shaped you? Because where you are might be telling your story louder than you think. And if this made you see Egypt, or even yourself, in a new way, hit subscribe now. Because we're just beginning to uncover how the land beneath us writes the code within us.